thank you for indulging us in that video, which I have to admit Billy put together in about 2 weeks. And I just want to thank him for all the work that has been put into this amazing event. My name is Doug Strong, Dean of the School of Theology, and very, very pleased and excited to be here this evening. It's great to have you all here on campus. We love the ministries that you're doing and pray for you, and are thankful to God for all that is going on in your congregations and in your lives. The theologian Karl Barth once wrote the following. He said, "The revelation of God encounters humanity on the presupposition and in confirmation of the fact that human attempts to know God from our own standpoint are wholly and entirely futile. In revelation, God revealing God's self to us, God tells us that He is God and Lord, while from our own perspective, we venture to grasp at God. In this grasping, we are struck to the very roots, to the heart, and our whole existence is called into question." Barth is describing what happens to us as individuals when we encounter the living God, but also what happens to us culturally when we encounter the crises of our society. We often, in our lives, all of us have had crisis moments when we first come to faith, and at other times when we encounter God. But we also may have crisis moments in our lives and in our congregations and even in our culture when we're confronted by the reality of our brokenness before God and one another. And in light of that, I want to tell you a story. About 10 years ago, I was a seminary professor and had been a seminary professor for about 10 years. And I went with a group of faculty, colleagues, and students on a trip to Korea. It was to be an immersion experience, an opportunity to get to know Korea. Frankly, I was very tired after a hard year of work, and was willing to go. It was an opportunity to see a new country. It was interesting to me. But my heart, my energies were not into going, but you know, it would be fine. And I went. On this trip, I got to know a number of our own students who went along, and one of them was a Korean American student named Sang-woo, who had the English name of Arnold. And Arnold had moved from Korea to the U.S. at age 11, and he was in his late 20s, and this was his first time since then to be back to the land of his birth. Well, it just so happened that Arnold was also going through a crisis of faith at this time. Not an unusual experience for seminarians, I must say. And so we ended up having long discussions late into the night about his faith and about what was going on, and they were very meaningful. These are the kinds of discussions that I'd had and have had scores of times with seminary students. And so I enjoyed helping him and talking through these issues. But over the course of several days, many days, we were in Korea, and I started to learn about his story of coming to the U.S., about what happened when he came to the U.S., about the pain of being separated from his homeland, about what it meant to be a Korean American, about what it meant to see my society through his eyes, gradually, over those days, I realized that he wasn't the only one having a crisis of faith. I too was having a crisis of faith. As I started to wonder about my complicity in the things that he had experienced, as I started to see a culture, a rich and deep culture, from a perspective that I had not understood before. As I began to see his life and his experience and the land of Korea and the Asian American reality through his eyes, it became very painful for me. And I started to realize that he wasn't the only person who was struggling. To use Barth's terms, my whole existence was being called into question. What would it mean, he and I wondered, if we could refashion our lives as American Christians so that our faith was intertwined with that of one another's and with everyone else, with other believers, with brothers and sisters of many colors? What would it mean if our ministries were being shaped and challenged by people who looked so differently from ourselves? What would it mean if teachers become learners and learners teachers? What would it mean if Christian faith was truly mutual and there was reciprocity between believers of different types? I'm glad that my existence was called into question on that trip. And I hope that our Lord will help all of us to move together toward the new heaven and the new earth, where all of us will praise him together. Amen. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for being here. This gathering, all of you here tonight, is really a dream come true, and we're so thankful for those of you who've joined us for this conference, our inaugural conference for the Asian American Ministry Program. We thank you. We thank you for those of you who have traveled from afar to join us for the launching of this event, to worship with us, to pray with us, and to dream with us about what this program could ultimately do to serve the gospel in the 21st century. Tonight, our guest, our plenary speaker for this evening, I think he hardly needs an introduction for many of us. There comes a time in every person's life where you read a book that just happens to stick with you. A book that speaks prophetically into your experience, that illuminates feelings that perhaps you may have felt, but have been unable to articulate. I'm really grateful for Dr. Soong-Chan Rah, for his gifts as a teacher, his gifts as a pastor, and his gifts as a prophet to inform our times, ultimately, for the flourishing of the gospel in the 21st century. Dr. Soong-Chan Rah is the Milton Ingebrigtsen Associate Professor of Church Growth and Evangelism at North Park Theological Seminary. And he's the author of this book, which has been a formative book in my own life personally, and has been a formative book in the shaping of this program, The Next Evangelicalism. Professor Rah, Dr. Rah, is formerly the founding pastor of Cambridge Community Fellowship Church, a multi-ethnic, urban-focused church that was committed to living out the values of racial reconciliation and social justice in the urban context. Dr. Soong-Chan Rah is not an ordinary professor. He is a professor who deeply loves the church, who deeply cares for the gospel, and ultimately deeply and is willing to speak with great courage to the North American church about its future. He's a pastor that has had 15 years of experience pastoring churches prior to his work and his appointment as a professor. And as we join tonight for this very, very special inaugural banquet for the Asian American Ministry Program, we could think of no one better that we wanted to join us tonight to usher in our work and to launch our program. So would you join me in welcoming Dr. Soong-Chan Rah?
I'm deeply honored to be a part of this wonderful occasion, the opportunity to share with you tonight. And I'm like getting chills at what the potential is here at Seattle Pacific and the work that is being formed, something that's being given birth this week. And my thanks to Billy for pioneering this work here at Seattle Pacific. I think there are some wonderful years ahead and great enthusiasm and great joy that lies ahead for this program. So I feel the burden of having to work through this material with you today. First of all, it's very hard to live up to an introduction like that, so thank you. But also the anxiety or the nervousness of recognizing just how serious of a work that we are being called to. And that there are some wonderful things that are occurring in the church globally and in the United States that I think we get to participate in. And this is indeed a very exciting moment. I just want to say, whoever did that video, that was phenomenal work. Thank you for doing something like that. It was really excellent work. Because one of the things that I've been thinking through is how are we going to communicate the changes that are occurring in the world around us? For most of us, I think in this room, we're aware of these changes, certainly globally. We see the reports, the books that we've read, a lot of the accounts that we've read about, the journal articles that show that Christianity in the world has clearly shifted away from Europe and North America to a much more African, Asian, and Latin American expression. So these are now clearly articulated, clearly stated in so many of our works, that there's a general consensus that this is the way world Christianity has come into. One of the things that I wanted to raise in the next evangelicalism was to not only see this shift from the north and the west to the south and the east globally, but also start looking at the ways that American Christianity, evangelicalism in particular, has also changed, and that there is an increasing diversity, as the statistics at the beginning of that wonderful presentation showed to us. This increasing diversity is an exciting thing. And many of you know the statistics that by 2042, in all likelihood, the majority of Americans will be people of color. The one that's more stark to me is that by 2023, the majority of children are going to be ethnic minorities, which means that no matter what Lou Dobbs says or Tom Tancredo does, that unless we start killing off children, which I don't even think they're suggesting that, I don't know, I haven't watched them lately, but unless we're going to do something drastic, within our lifetime, the majority of Americans are going to be ethnic minorities. So we're in an age where there are these monumental shifts occurring, first of all, in global Christianity, and then in American society, and then also in American evangelicalism or in American Christianity. So the question for me tonight is not, are these changes occurring? The question is not, what is happening in the world that we need to respond to? It's more, these are actual realities. These are done deals. These are things that are historical realities right now. They're not a future projection. These are historical realities of the state of American Christianity, of the state of global Christianity. These are the realities that we're dealing with. So the question is not, are things changing? The question is, how are we, the church, the denominations, the Christian institutions, and certainly the seminaries and the Christian colleges, going to respond to these changes that, again, are a done deal, and the trajectory is already in progress? Now, the church typically has not been very good at responding to change. In fact, we have always been a few decades behind on what the rest of the world has already started to engage in. And probably the best example for me is how American Christians right now are so obsessed with postmodernity. Everything is postmodern this, postmodern that, and we write volumes of books on postmodernity. And I'm not saying postmodernity is not important. I'm just surprised at how much ink has been spilled on something that is more of a historical reality than actual impact in the world today. So if you talk to anybody in kind of secular philosophical thought, postmodern thought is something that we talked about 20 years ago. But in the church, we're still talking about it as if it's going to shape whatever is going on in the world right now. So we have always responded a decade or two behind when it came to changes in the world. But what I want to ask is, how can we, maybe the church, could actually be a few steps ahead? And one of the things that I speak about in the next evangelicalism is that this might actually be a moment where the church is actually moving faster in terms of a trend than American society as a whole. That we're seeing diversity at a rate faster in the American church than we're seeing in the larger culture. So again, the question is not, are these changes occurring? They are occurring. The question is, how are we as a church going to respond to these changes? And I think there are multiple ways of engaging this, but I want to talk about two in particular. One is what I would say is the way of cultural captivity. And that's what I, again, talk about in the book, about the direction and trajectory of trying to, being held and captive to a particular cultural framework and reference, that we can't move outside of those boundaries. And the other way is maybe proposed by the great missiologist Andrew Walls, who talks about the serial nature of Christianity. So let's think about Walls for a minute and some of the great works, the articles that he's written and the books that he's written, something like the Ephesian moment, that we are right now in an Ephesian moment, very similar to what we saw in the New Testament times, the moment when Gentile Christianity interacted with Jewish Christianity and presented a moment where there were these multiple cultures and multiple cultural expressions of Christianity in the world. And we're seeing the same thing now, 2,000 years later. We're in an Ephesian moment. And Walls talks about that Christianity is a serial expression, that there are places where Christianity increases in terms of its influence on that culture, but then it kind of winds down, and then another culture increases. And so you see there's multiple serial expressions of Christianity. So that kind of mentality that Walls is talking about means that we hold very loosely to some of the cultural forms of Christianity. So you can see how Walls's paradigm of a serial Christianity would be in contrast to what I think is at the moment that we're in right now, where we are talking about a cultural captivity or a serial Christianity. And again, there are a lot of variations in between, but I'm setting these two things up, two paradigms up, as two of the ways that we can go in American Christianity. We could either hang on to dear life to Western cultural captivity, or we can acknowledge that Christianity is a serial expression, and there are always these new forms or new expressions of Christianity that continue to form and to shape what Christianity is going to look like. And I want to frame this in the particular context of Asian American ecclesiology and Asian American theology. What does it mean to be an Asian American Christian theologian, seminary student, church, in the context of cultural captivity? And what does it mean to be a Christian, Asian Christian theologian, pastor, seminary student, or an academic institution in the context of serial Christianity and the difference therein? So let's talk a little bit about cultural captivity. When you have a cultural captivity, then you develop a Christian response as an Asian American to that cultural captivity that forces you, in some sense, to become subservient to that cultural captivity. So if the dominant paradigm of the way we engage with these changes in the world around us is this kind of cultural captivity, then we fall underneath that by saying we're going to be a part of that captivity, and in fact, we're going to further perpetuate that cultural captivity. So if the larger context of American Christianity is held captive to Western culture or to white culture, and an Asian American engages that culture, then the result is a perpetuating of that cultural captivity. the best explanation for me would be going to the time of apartheid in South Africa. During the time of apartheid in South Africa, the Japanese businessmen didn't really have a good category for them because they couldn't be categorized as white because they were not white. They couldn't be categorized as black because they were not black, and obviously they wouldn't have the rights, or they couldn't be categorized as colored, and they couldn't be categorized as Asian because that usually meant South Asian, Indian and South Asian Indians, and they didn't have the rights either. So they needed a category that the Japanese businessmen would feel accepted in larger South African culture, but at the same time show that they're very distinct. So the South African government, in all their creativity, created a category. And that category was honorary white people. So the Japanese businessmen became honorary white people in South African society. Now, clearly they weren't white, but they could be considered honorary whites. So when you are dealing with the context of cultural captivity, one of the responses of the Asian American Christian could be, I want to become an honorary white person. Because that's the way to get ahead in Christian society. That's the way to advance as an evangelical. That's the way to get the jobs or to get the notoriety or to act in a particular way that accepts you into larger white cultural captivity, and now you're operating as an honorary white person without all the rights therein. You're just an honorary white person. So one of the concerns that I have is that in the context of these very dramatic changes in global Christianity and American Christianity, is the danger that the Asian American community will strive for honorary white status. And that would be our goal. That would be what we want to become, the Uncle Toms of American evangelicalism. So we might operate with this mentality as the Uncle Toms of American evangelicalism. We are very easily used by larger evangelical culture to further perpetuate Western cultural captivity. Think of it in these terms. So I'm asked to do a lot of boards, nonprofit boards, and I'm on too many nonprofit boards, to be honest with you, but that's because I make a very good token Asian. I really am. I'm a professional token Asian. Because I'm one of the few, aside from Eugene Cho, with actual facial hair. So I look really good in these photos as, wow, he must be a samurai or something. I don't know. So I make a great token Asian. So the opportunity for me to be an honorary white person as a token Asian are plentiful. To go into these cultural contexts, predominantly white cultural contexts, and to represent the Asian perspective, whatever that might be. And so operating under this umbrella of cultural captivity, I have the privilege or I have the honor of coming into these contexts and operate as an honorary white person. And what happens in that context is that I can further perpetuate Western cultural captivity. Why? Because in that context, hey, we have an Asian on our board. Hey, we have an Asian in our school, on our faculty. Hey, we have an Asian in our denomination. Now that Asian might operate in the context as completely as a white Westerner. In fact, maybe more than the whites in the room can operate as a white Westerner. But now the whole of that enterprise of that particular group is justified with these tokens. Token white, token black, token native, token Latino. The list can go token women. The list can go on with all this tokenism. So in the context of a cultural captivity, the best that we can hope for, the best that we can strive for, is to become honorary white people, the Uncle Toms of American Christianity, and the token Asian as one voice that represents all the Asians in the world. Billions and billions of people I represent at these meetings. It's a terrible, terrible burden. But that's part of the responsibility as the token Asian in the context of the larger cultural captivity. So that's one way that we fit in. We become honorary white people. We become the token. And what that does is it completely sheds away or strips away the fact that we're made in the beautiful image of God. And all we're asked to do is just to be a caricature, to be someone who justifies the status quo rather than we're actually allowed to challenge the status quo. In the process of doing that, in the process of becoming honorary white people that are caught up in this cultural captivity, we don't realize how much of our own identity we have sacrificed. because that context now creates this sense of what we call otherness. And some of you might be familiar with the work of Edward Said in the book Orientalism. Said was a Palestinian, taught at Columbia University in the literature department for many years, and he wrote a book that was a landmark work during its time. And you got to remember, this is I think it was in the early 70s when he wrote this book, and he talks about this idea of the creation of the other. How many of you are fans of Lost? Did you like how it ended? Okay, just checking. I'm taking a poll. I'm writing. So Lost, you might remember, had a character by the name of Said. Now, I don't know if they did this on purpose, because Lost had a lot of these characters like John Locke and Jack Shepherd. So they played around with these names, but they had one Middle Eastern character, and his name was Said. And in that television show, they had a group of evil people, or perceived as evil. What were they called? They were called the others, the others. So I think, I don't know, maybe they have read Said, but I think there might be a reference to what Edward Said is talking about in this work. What Said says is that the process of Orientalism is the ability of the dominant culture, or one culture, to define another culture. And so this quotation here, Orientalism can be discussed and analyzed as the corporate institution for dealing with the Orient, dealing with it by making statements about it, authorizing views of it, describing it by teaching it, settling it, ruling over it. In short, Orientalism is a Western style for dominating structure and having authority over the Orient. So this process of Orientalism essentially exoticizes a foreign culture, another culture, the other culture, and creates a distance from that culture and your culture. But in that process also, you are saying you are different from us, and we have the authority over you to define you. We have the authority over you to tell you who you are, and you don't have the authority to determine for yourself who you are. So what Orientalism does is that it objectifies and it exoticizes the other. And in this case, Said is talking about Middle Eastern or Arabic or Semitic culture, and saying the West, by exoticizing that culture, ultimately creates a sense of distance. So that once that distance is created, that group is very easily couched as the enemy. Why? Because that group is so different from us, so exotic, so unique, or so out of our categories that they are the other. And in the creation of that otherness of that other category, now you can say, hey, we don't want to have anything to do with you because you're not like us. You are the other. Even as we try to deal with cultural captivity, even as we enter into this honorary white person status, ultimately we still operate as the other in the larger context. Let's take a look at some of the other examples in larger culture. This is Samuel Huntington, a professor. He passed away recently, but he was a professor at Harvard. And after reading Who Are We, I guess it doesn't take much to be a professor at Harvard, because what he writes in this particular work is the elimination of the racial ethnic components of national identity and the challenges to its cultural and creedal components raise questions concerning the prospects for American identity. Then he gets more specific. A massive Hispanic influx raised questions concerning America's linguistic and cultural unity. So what Huntington argues is that the American identity needs to be, by and large, defined by white Western culture. And with the influx of Hispanics, that cultural identity is being challenged. So what Huntington argues is there is an other. The other is Hispanics. The others are those who are not defined by Western white culture. So Huntington would create this one particular culture, and those who stand outside of that culture would not be welcomed. Now let's talk about some of the public policy that goes with this. Some of you might remember this debate not that long ago. There was a representative, was it in Texas, I believe? In Texas, this is the headline: lawmakers suggest Asian descendant voters should adopt names easier for Americans to deal with. I don't know if you remember this. There was let's just read through this. During public hearings of the voter identification legislation in the House Senate, State Rep. Betty Brown suggested that Asian Americans might want to adopt names that are easier for Americans to deal with when they want to vote, so their names will match what is on registration rolls. And this is what she said to the Asian person who was actually against this legislation. Do you think that it would behoove you and your citizens to adopt the name that we could deal with more readily here? Brown later tells Coe, can't you see that this is something that would make it a lot easier for you and the people who are poll workers if you could adopt a name just for identification purposes that's easier for Americans to deal with? Now pay close attention to the language. I put it in red and blue for a reason. The red is you people, you other people with your funny sounding names, and we people, the Americans with the right sounding names apparently. Now please note that this is all Americans that are in this conversation, because non-Americans aren't voting in these elections. So she is talking about all US citizens, and yet she clearly creates this category of we Americans operate one way, and you foreigners, even though you're American citizens, operate another way. The creation of otherness. Now when I heard this, I went out and changed my name right away, because it used to be John, and I changed it to Soong-Chan so that I wouldn't have to deal with this lady. No, so there is this sense of creating the otherness. You are different from us. Your names sound funny. You look different. And so we would not even attain our honorary white person status because there is this creation of the otherness. Well, you know, this is the secular world. Sam Huntington teaches at an evil institution known as Harvard. And clearly this woman who was what? Is she a Republican or a Democrat? Well, it says Republican, but she probably underneath is a Democrat. So clearly these are evil people that are creating these evil ideas out there. You know, we wouldn't have any problem like this in the church now, would we? Certainly in the church, we don't create an otherness. Certainly in the church, a group of the majority culture doesn't get to define what the rest of the culture looks like, sounds like, and acts like. Well, it turns out that that's not usually the case. It turns out that more often than not, there is, even in the church, the defining of the other by the majority culture. There are a couple of examples of this. The first one that I can remember is a fairly recent phenomenon. There was a book that was put up by a publishing company called Deadly Viper, Character Assassin. And it was a book on leadership, development, and integrity that used the images of kung fu, martial artists, ninjas, all this conflation. You know, kung fus and ninjas are different. We do know that, right? Many of us? Okay. Well, Asians know that. I don't know how many of these guys didn't know that. But there was all this conflation of kung fu and ninja and all this stuff as a fun way to present information or content on on Christian leadership. So what was interesting is some of the emails that we would get or some of the blog posts that came up as we raised some protests about this. And the second line there is one of the protests. It is sad to see that people in the Christian community place higher emphasis on their culture than on the work God is doing. So essentially laying out that culture is not what God is doing. And especially you people should not get angry if those of us who are in the dominant culture decide this is how we want to present you. Maybe another example of this would be this example. 2004, I believe it was. So this was not like 1865. This is 2004. A major publishing company decides to do a VBS curriculum called Rickshaw Rally. So I love the font. I mean, you know, you have to look into the 70s font catalog to get that welcome font. And the whole idea was this vacation Bible school that picked up on Japanese culture. Well, you see here a conflation of a lot of different cultures. And in fact, when I first got the catalog for this VBS, I really thought it was a joke. I thought it was, hey, somebody's doing some kind of, you know, Mad Magazine satire. It's the Onion magazine I got by mistake. But no, it actually turned out to be the real thing, because I went online and checked up www.rickshawrally.com, and lo and behold, a gong sounds, and da-da-da-da-dun-dun-dun-dun-dun comes out. And here is Rickshaw Rally, the vacation Bible school curriculum that's going to save millions of Southern Christians. So this is the curriculum that was created. Now, a number of us, justifiably, I believe, raised the issue and said this is Orientalism. I mean, in literal form, this is Orientalism, because you are creating a cultural presentation that is not just inaccurate, but an exoticizing of the other culture. So this was their theme song, grab your kimono, come on and let's go on an Asian challenge. Now, by the way, in the original first round of the, this is actual slides from the curriculum. In the first round, they didn't say Asian, they said Oriental challenge, not Asian, and they changed it because that was part of the major changes they enacted once there was a protest raised. Racing in a rickshaw, we'll be making friends all over the Japanese islands. That's how it was sung, by the way. If you listen to the audio, it was sung just like a Japanese islands. On the far out, far east rickshaw rally, racing to the sun. So this idea, now you're seeing it, right? The exoticizing of a culture and the establishment of you are different from us. You are the far east. You are out there. And this is my favorite, wax on, wax off, get your rickshaw ready, swerve and curve and hold your rickshaw steady. And this was hilarious to me because one of the things that when a number of Asian Americans protested the curriculum, we said, did you do any research on this? And they said, yes, we went to a Japanese ad agency and they told us how to portray Asian culture. We went to a white missionary to Japan and they told us how to present Asian culture. So there were 13 white males in Nashville, Tennessee somewhere, and a Japanese ad agency and a white missionary to Japan said, this is how Asian culture is supposed to be portrayed. Now think about this for a moment. Not only is this an Orientalism and exoticizing, there is no representation within that community out of the Asian community. So who is defining how Asian culture is going to be portrayed? Who gets to make that decision? Who gets to make the decision to say, this is the way Asian culture is going to be represented for literally millions of children all throughout Alabama? Who gets to make that decision? The Asian Americans did not have a voice in that decision. We were voiceless. And by the way, they told us, oh yeah, we went to the great research. Now, what research did they get the wax on, wax off from? They watched Karate Kid 1, which, by the way, 8-year-olds have no idea where that reference is, but it's only the 40-year-old racist teachers that know it's coming from Karate Kid 1. So here are some wonderful images that we might remember. You've got the happy kid with the peasant hat. You've got the 8-year-old geisha. You've got the 4-year-old martial arts master. And then these other pictures that kind of emerged out of the story of Rickshaw Rally. I raised this to help us think through in these actual images. Who gets to define us? Now, I'm okay with somebody else defining me, as long as that somebody else is God. If God tells me who I am, I'm down with that. I will submit to God's defining who I am. In fact, that's what being a Christian is, yielding to the defining of God over your life. But I'm a little bit more anxious and nervous when a group of white males in Nashville, Tennessee decide this is who I am. When a group of the dominant culture, the privileged dominant culture says this is who you are, and not only is this who you are, but we are going to present this to the entire nation, to an entire generation of young people who know nothing about Asian culture, and we're going to present to them as the definitive and defining presentation of Asian culture. Who gets to define us? Well, there's a couple of ways to look at this. One is, they did wrong, which they did. They did wrong in presenting our culture in a way that was not only offensive and insensitive, but did not take into account who we really are. It was inaccurate. They did wrong. But there's also the other side of it for us as Asian Americans. We allowed that to happen. We allowed somebody else besides God. We allowed the people in privileged positions. We allowed them to define who we are. And now at first you think that's an offense to Asian culture. But ultimately it's an offense against God. Because what we said was, it is more important how humans describe who we are rather than how God describes who we are. It is more important that somebody out there, some evangelical group out there, gets to tell the world this is who we are, rather than saying it is God who defines my identity. Whether that's a cultural identity, gender identity, Christian identity, all of these identities were taken away from us and co-opted by another cultural group. And at that point, that's not their fault, that's our fault. Because we allowed this defining to happen and just let it happen. The question and challenge that I want to raise to you again is not, are these changes occurring? They are occurring. But what are we as a Christian community going to do to respond to the changes that are occurring around us? And I'm so thrilled for what's happening in this community. It's not to say that we're going to create an Asian theology that is just for Asians. Because once you do that, then you've perpetuated cultural captivity. It's just now in a new form, and it's just for Asians to hang out together and have cultural captivity among Asians. What I would hope we could see emerging is an expression out of the Asian and the Asian American experience that really informs and serves the larger Christian community. Because sometimes the best learning that we can do is to see and encounter a Christian that looks different from us, from a different cultural context. I'll just share my story in closing. I grew up in a Southern Baptist church, actually. I love the Southern Baptist church, where they're wonderful people, and I'm one of the Southern Baptist people. I love the Southern Baptist church because that's the church that I grew up in. It was the context of ministry for me and my formation in my youth group. So I grew up in the context of the Southern Baptist church, a Korean Southern Baptist church, and that shaped who I am. I lost my train of thought. But what I would hope in my experience is that that is not the end of my story. It doesn't end with my growing up in the context of a Southern Baptist church. Because the formation of my theology was extraordinarily benefited from growing up in a Southern Baptist church. However, there was something about my experience that stretched further. And that's been my experience in the African American community. I've just been blessed with pastors in my life who are from the African American community. Bishop Green, Ray Hammond, Eugene Rivers. There's just a number, the list goes on and on, of a number of African American pastors who just graciously and lovingly walked alongside me as a young pastor in ministry when I was a pastor in Boston. And what it did is it held up a different image of what the gospel could be. And the rich learning that I did as growing up in a Korean Southern Baptist church was enhanced and stretched by interacting with the African American church. But it was the same thing as I encountered Native American Christians as well. The rich learning that I had grown out of in the Asian Southern Baptist church and experience in the African American church, now there's an experience in the Native American church. And what that does is it challenges and it reshapes my thinking. It reshapes my thinking not in a way that it makes me stop being a Christian, but it makes me a Christian that loves God from all the different angles that are there. And so when we encounter or when we engage in this contextualized theology that is being formed right here in this gathering, my hope is that it doesn't end just at these tables or just in that classroom. But the narrative that emerges provides a counter-narrative or an additional narrative or another angle. All the different things that will actually make evangelicalism stronger, will actually make American Christianity stronger, will actually make American Christianity more relevant to a broader context. So my hope for this institution here is that God will do an amazing thing by strengthening and encouraging Asian American pastors and seminary students that really could use a lot of this encouragement, but that this would also inform and strengthen and encourage the larger church in America as well. God, I thank you for the work of this community. It's here at Seattle Pacific. And even as they launch this wonderful ministry, I pray that your Spirit will be found in the midst of them and send them forth in ways that they can't even imagine or hope for right now. But we know that you are able to do far more than we can imagine or hope. So we ask that, Lord, you would take this ministry into ways that are just going to bless not only the Asian community, but all the communities and all the churches and all the Christian expression here in the United States and throughout the world. So I pray a blessing upon the leadership, upon Billy, upon the faculty, and upon the administration, that as you launch this ministry here at Seattle Pacific, that you would bless them to go forth to do the work that you've called them to. I ask this in your name. Amen.
Thanks, Soong-Chan, always stirring the pot. So, one of the things that is often said within the School of Theology here at Seattle Pacific University, within the seminary, is a desire on behalf of the leadership to do theology in service to the church. And one of the things that we wanted to symbolize that this evening by is inviting a pastor among us to dialogue over these issues, as well as Dr. Soong-Chan Rah and myself. So I would like to just introduce our next guest as well. You all know him. He's one of us here in the Pacific Northwest. Pastor Eugene Cho. He is the founder of Quest Seattle Church. He is also the founder of One Day's Wages, a wonderful organization that is innovatively thinking about how to deal with extreme poverty. Would you join me in welcoming Pastor Eugene Cho and Dr. Soong-Chan Rah back to the stage for a discussion? And we're just going to hide behind here. And excuse me. Yeah. Oh, sure. Sounds great. Okay, so okay, I'm going to deviate a little bit off script if this is okay. I just got to ask this question. Okay, so Soong-Chan, one of the things that we dream about in terms of, oh yeah, please, right here, here we go. Excuse me. One of the things that we dream about for the Asian American Ministry Program is that this wouldn't just be an ethnic-specific program. That it's something that serves the church in North America, that is relevant to not just our Asian American students, but really all of our students at the seminary. And, obviously there are some folks here that aren't Asian American. Folks here that, brothers and sisters in Christ who really have devoted their lives, and their resources to the gospel. In our audience, who may be uncomfortable with some of the language that you use in your book. More explicitly, one of the things you talk about is white Western cultural captivity. Can you elaborate why you chose those words? And for our audience and for really,
Was that your original title?
So the original title of the book was actually The White Captivity Church, and it went to two different publishers. One publisher said, we're not going near the title. The other said, that sounds okay, and then right before it was about to be published, it got changed to The Next Evangelicalism, because most authors don't get to determine our own title. So part of it was, that was my angry Asian man phase. That apparently is still going on, I guess. I think, I guess I'm mellowing with age, and no, I'm not actually. I'm just kidding. But I am trying to figure out what is the best way to communicate what are, I think, hard truths. And there are times when we use maybe deliberately and intentionally provocative language, and I think it's okay for Christians to experience discomfort. In fact, I think that's sometimes the only way we grow. Unless we're uncomfortable, we tend to remain in the same spot, right? Unless we're actually uncomfortable, we actually will move in a different direction. So part of my hope was to create and generate a sense of discomfort, to be able to say, maybe we've been stuck in a cultural captivity and a way of looking at Christianity that is not good for the future. And some of that provocative language might generate at least conversation. Yeah. So honestly, it's probably a mixed bag. Some people probably looked at the book or read certain parts of it and said, I don't want to deal with this information. And others that I found are really engaged in it. And so, I think those things are kind of a mixed bag.
Yeah. No, certainly it's very provocative. And, but I think you have this, I really like your point. I mean, you think about the fact that, in 2008, the U.S. Census, and I know these figures have kind of changed, but, in 2008, the U.S. Census talks about how in 2023, there will be more minority children among us than our Caucasian brothers and sisters. There will be more minority adults, people of color, in 2042. And so, I just had to get a little bit more perspective on that for our audience. One of the things that I've heard on occasion that's really kind of moved me, and I wanted to set the context. I think sometimes it's really helpful to be able to hear really the stories behind writing certain books like this. So I was just wondering if you could share with our audience tonight a little bit more about maybe the story that informed the writing of the Next Evangelicals.
Sure. And I write about it in one of the chapters that I've kind of worked my way up through the evangelical system. Was very active in the Southern Baptist Church, had a very evangelical conversion, was involved in evangelical institutions like University, went to a evangelical seminary, Gordon Conwell, and then teaching at an evangelical seminary now, as well as being on a lot of these circles of evangelicalism, and yet at the end of the day still feeling somewhat marginalized. And there was a question that I was asking, why is this the case? Why is it that in terms of the evangelical credentials, I can line those up, and yet still feeling marginalized? And I had to ask, is it me? Is there something that I'm doing wrong? Or is there something within the cultural context of evangelicalism that seems to maybe prevent us from engaging as different people of color? And one of the things that I've been looking at in recent years, that's not in the book, but I've been trying to unpack a little bit, is black evangelicalism in the 1970s and 1980s. And what I found was a tremendous move among African American evangelicals to engage in larger evangelical culture, but then facing a tremendous amount of rejection. And it's a deep wounding that occurred where a great opportunity was lost because there was an expectation of towing a certain line. It wasn't even a theological line at some points. It was kind of an ecclesio-sociological line that was being set out there for black evangelicals to tow. And seeing that story repeated in the 21st century is quite disheartening. But hopefully these books will kind of challenge some of the presuppositions that we have about what evangelicalism has to look like or should look like.
That's great. Pastor Eugene, you, through your online writings, on your blog, through Quest, through One Day's Wages, you have you've become a much more prominent figure, I think, nationally. I'm wondering if you at all have experienced maybe anything like this, in your own story and in your own ministry.
Billy, let me just share a couple things really quickly. I love your beard, Soong-Chan, so let's just get that out of the way.
I'm trying to look like you, man.
Yeah, it looks good. But just a couple things. I think, aside from the prophetic aspect of the book, there's really a practical aspect to it that I think we've kind of touched on, that the world is changing around us.
Right.
And I think if we can maybe get over some of the perception of this is just coming from angry Asian men, this is actually a gift to the church, because it's going to help us prepare for what has already come.
Yeah.
And churches and institutions and denominations, for a variety of reasons, there's not just one reason, but this is one of the reasons why they may not be around in a decade or two.
Mm-hmm.
So part of the reason why I recommend this book, while I don't agree with all of it in its entirety, sorry, Soong-Chan, but it's a gift because there's something there that helps us to prepare for something that's already in our backyard. I'm part of a denomination, if I can share that here, Evangelical Covenant Church, that I think are doing some good things, and they get lots of pats on their backs and praises for the way that they're opening up their doors to people of color and ethnic churches. But in reality, I would say, there's certainly that, but really they saw the writing on the wall.
That's great.
Before other denominations or institutions, they saw the writing on the wall and they said, beyond biblical and theological reasons, which are great, there were practical issues like we're not going to be relevant, we're not going to be around unless we welcome these brothers and sisters, not just as token people of color, but as part of our family. So I would want to share that this book is really a gift to the church, the capital C church.
Yeah.
As for these stories, I mean, I don't want to make these sweeping generalizations, but I think in some form or another, we've all experienced, because this is part of our human brokenness and sinfulness. If it's not happening in that particular context, in every culture and every society, there are people who are abusing and manipulating and distorting power to usurp others or to exploit others. And so I came here when I was 6 years old, and I went through my classic struggle of who am I? I went through a very extensive stage where I was really upset and angry at my identity. I hated being Asian. Absolutely hated it. I was really confused. And I know that some of you, maybe not all, but some of you may have gone through similar stories where people told me to go home. And growing up in San Francisco in the Mission District, I grew up in a fairly African-American neighborhood. And so that was the common word or phrase that I would hear, go home. And I actually did go back to Korea one summer. And when I went back to Korea, it was very perplexing as a junior high school kid, because I was told the exact same thing, go back home. And so high school was a very turbulent time for me, where it's a story that, as I've shared with others, people have resonated with that. And I think while I expected comfort and embrace and understanding in the evangelical church context, it was very complex, sometimes more nuanced in terms of pushback and not full acceptance. So there's lots of stories that we probably don't have the time to get into, but it's something that I think, if not we personally, if you're serving in an Asian American context, this is a guarantee there are people within our churches that have gone through stories of exclusion, marginalization, Orientalism, or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
It's in our congregation. It's part of our story.
Yeah, yeah. That's great. Yeah, I mean, I certainly can resonate with that myself. I mean, having grown up in Bellingham, Washington, being born and raised there. But I won't get into that right now. So, I want to touch on this idea, especially in the context of some of the things that I know that both you and Soong-Chan had been very publicly involved in. This deadly viper crisis with a Christian book publisher that shall remain unnamed, but starts with a Z. So, sorry. I can say that only because there was a wonderful piece of reconciliation, I think, that took place at the end of the day, where Zondervan actually did meaningfully repent in some ways. So I guess I want to bring this back to this, this question, though, that you touched upon, Soong-Chan and Eugene, is this idea that somehow truth, that somehow advocacy, can actually be very, very beneficial, particularly in our times when we think about the changing church and how American society is changing. I just wondering if you guys could elaborate a little bit more on that. I think for many of us as Asian Americans, sometimes we resist, kind of the prophetic critique of speaking too much truth. And I think in the context of this deadly viper crisis, both of you actually encountered folks that were very, very supportive of essentially your critique. But then there were others that actually chose to be a little bit more silent. And so I wonder if you guys could elaborate on maybe the variety of responses that were, given toward the crisis, and your thoughts on those.
I really hope at the end of the day that those are not the moments that define Asian American Christianity. So I really hope that there's more to the story that we have ahead of us. And I think it was an interesting social story that emerged out of this, in that, and a number of people have said this, that it was one of the first times that Asian American Christians really spoke out in the numbers that we did. And it could be because we're all internet geeks and we just like to stay online and hang out there. Whatever the reason was, it appeared that the Asian community, again, regardless of where people stood on the issue, was at least able to articulate something for which we had not been able to do before. So in that sense, I was appreciative of the large number of voices that did come out of this and spoke out about this, but not just in terms of supporting opposition to the curriculum, but also those who said, hey, I see no problem with it. or hey, I have a different take on it. At least we were speaking and we were being heard. I don't say that in kind of a political, fight to power, maybe a little bit, but ultimately it's the fact that there was a willingness to move out of type and to move out of stereotypes and move out of that and into expressing ourselves in ways, again, through the internet and through other ways that actually vocalized maybe a lot of things that we've been feeling. So that was, again, regardless of where people stood on the issue, I was just very thankful that was happening.
Eugene, did you have some other response?
Yeah, I think there were many people involved in that. Soong-Chan and I were probably one of the more vocal or prominent ones, but there were numerous. I can look in this room here, and I know many of you wrote and contributed in dialogue and conversations. And just to affirm what Soong-Chan was saying, I think sometimes there's this broad stroke that all Asian Americans think alike, that we look alike. That was supposed to be funny, and we think alike. And so I think it was good, even though, to be honest with you, it was very personally uncomfortable for me that there were those that did not agree, and not only disagreed, were also maybe critical of the manner in which Asian Americans spoke out against this issue. So I didn't necessarily take it personally, but at times it was personally painful. But it was also really encouraging because I think it did foster a dialogue. But another reason why I thought this was really important, it does speak to us about how much things have changed, because as Soong-Chan was talking about the rickshaw event, I mean, I heard about that months after the whole situation blew up. So it wasn't actually during, and I'm not quite sure it was through, I don't know how I learned about it, but it wasn't during the actual time that Soong-Chan and others were voicing concerns about it. With this, with the onset of this thing called the internet, I mean, I went to a staff meeting at our church, came away, and in my inbox on the day of, there were just so many emails from people around the country saying, what do you think about this? Do you want to comment on this? Had reporters writing about this, and just people from different backgrounds, both for or against, asking me to kind of engage this conversation. So last thing I'll say, I'm encouraged by it because we need to revive a spirit of activism in the Asian American church. If there is another broad stereotype that we need to debunk and just get rid of, it is the stereotype of passivity that is very, very prevalent in the Asian American church. And so, regardless whether you agree or disagree, we need women and men to stand up and shout. This is very important. And not just for Asian American issues. I think this is very key. Sometimes if we do speak up, they tend to be for issues that pertain specifically to us. And I was particularly moved by what Dr. Brian Banton was talking about last night, that there is a lot of affinity, shared story. And so I would encourage us to revive that spirit of activism. It's ironic for me because as a Korean American, activism is so inherent in Korean culture, right? Like, we are so gifted in protesting. It is amazing, and that's not meant to be a joke. We are so, because these folks, these people, historically speaking, they made a pledge amongst the people that when there were certain horrific incidents of abuse of power by the government, they said never again. And so there became this like culture of protest that was very embedded. And so in the Asian American church, it's almost non-existent. And so we really can't afford to just lean on the one angry Asian man.
Is somebody behind you?
I'll stop right there. I was going to come dressed as a ninja today, just FYI.
Actually, just to build on what you said a little bit earlier, I feel if there's another direction we can go further on, is the advocacy not only for ourselves, as you mentioned, as Eugene, but the advocacy for others. How are we as an Asian American community speaking for the voices that have not been heard? And I'll confess this right now, I've done a horrible job of advocating for women. And I'm ashamed of it because the three most important people in my life are women, my grandma, my mom, and my wife, and my daughter, and my son too, he's in the mix as well. But that I have not advocated for women as well as I need to. And how am I advocating for the African American community, Latino community, Native American communities, and for the predominant Anglo communities as well. And so when does our advocacy start moving out of a selfishness into a selflessness?
That's great. Now, you know, just to be clear, I think the thing that, and you talk about this in Many Colors, your new book.
On sale now.
Great book. Now, you know, one of the challenges, I think that with the proliferation of blogs, of the online community, and that sort of thing is that for us as Christians, it'd be so easy for us to focus on essentially remaining cultural critics, right? Rather than having a redemptive voice, a reconciling voice in the midst of injustice. This story actually did end with a degree of reconciliation. I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that story and how you guys engaged it, how things ended. Maybe some final thoughts there?
Well, these are ongoing stories.
Okay.
There's, you know...
Specifically for the Deadly Viper.
Oh, that one.
Yeah, sorry.
No, these are ongoing stories. I think I mean, honestly, I think Eugene and Ken and some of the others who were involved in a lot of these things really felt tired at the end of that. I mean, just like emotionally and spiritually exhausted. And I realized just in my personal commitment to racial reconciliation, that reconciliation really is an ongoing story. And these kinds of moments where these flare up kind of bring it to the surface, but it's a reminder that this is a long journey ahead of us. So I look at it as, you know, it was important for us to raise and bring, you know, it's like, you know, when you have family squabbles, sometimes you need that. But then hopefully you have an ongoing discussion after those family squabbles that are more public and more vociferous. But then afterwards you try to work these things through and you live together as a community and as a people. So for me, it's not just that event and that resolution, but hopefully I'm committed to reconciliation, again, hopefully for the rest of my life. I'm striving for that.
You know, Billy, I think we're reminded, no matter whether it's this issue or others, that we're never an island to ourselves. We're bound together with our brothers and sisters. And that's just important for us to be reminding ourselves again and again that ultimately our enemies aren't people within the larger church. That story I thought was encouraging for the many reasons that we shared. But I mean, I think if we can be honest, it was important for Soong-Chan, for myself, for others involved, and hopefully for others here that we had requested that the book be removed. Yeah. So that was pretty huge, that a major publisher chose to hear our concerns, and we felt genuinely heard. That was very encouraging. I think that's the surface level, which is great and good. I think part of the reason why it was exhausting is because there was a lot of dialogue and relationships and conversations that took place behind the scenes between authors, between various voices as well. And I can say this, I mean, the authors of the book are people that I knew before this incident flared up, and they remain more friends now than they were with me a few years ago. Now, having said that, I wish that there were more conversations that took place. Now, I'm not quite sure what Soong-Chan was referring to, but part of the reason why it was tiring for me is that you can keep knocking on the door. Mm-hmm. but if there isn't an open or a response to that knocking, it's pretty exhausting. And I know that while it may be a done deal for many, that there are still some that harbor ill will. And that personally bums me out, part of it for selfish reasons. Not to make it sound like I'm some kind of martyr or something, but probably once every couple months I get a comment via email or my blog that you're a book burner, which is not the way that I would like to be known for. And I think part of that is because somehow the situation in its entirety, there needed to be more. And I think there can be more, and I hope there will be more as well. The deadly viper situation, I don't think will be the last of these kind of incidents. Yeah. Not that we want to be known for such things, but it won't be the last.
And I think the tiring part was recognizing there will be more. And I think the advocacy part from the dominant cultures community is that I think maybe that's a definition of privilege, to be able to walk away from that, start over, and not have that follow you. Whereas I think for many of the Asians who are involved in this, we can't walk away from it. It still follows us. And not only does it still follow us, we know that potentially this could happen again in the very near future. So for us, that's why I'm saying reconciliation is an ongoing thing. I can't get away from it because I know this is the story that goes on. Whereas part of privilege is to be able to walk away and just completely forget about it.
Some great final thoughts there. Well, all of this, ultimately, the idea of advocacy, the idea of even speaking to our brothers and sisters of the dominant culture, the idea of pursuing reconciliation is ultimately, I see it rooted in the future of the church, in the future, the flourishing of the gospel, and really the body of Christ essentially being one in the Revelation 7:9 reality, where we actually see all cultures, tribes, tongues coming in and worshiping before the Lord. I guess what I want to talk to you guys, to switch the question now, one of the things that we're doing here at Seattle Pacific Seminary is we're trying to envision what it means for us to train and form leaders for the 21st century. A century in which American society is changing, a century in which the church is changing drastically, both globally as well as within the United States. As you have spoken kind of in your book, as you have thought about it, I'm wondering if you can speak to what it would look like for us to prepare leaders to be servants of the gospel in the 21st century.
Well, I think the larger question is, what does seminary education look like for the next 50 years? And I don't think any of us have an answer to that. It's just such a complex question. And I think most of us would agree it can't look like what it's looked like for the last 100 years, because the context has changed, not just in terms of ethnic diversity, but just the way American society is. We're going to just have to start rethinking some of these things and what seminary education looks like for the next 40, 50 years. And so, as that's the good part of that is that we can be a part of that reimagining. We can be a part of that rethinking of what seminary education looks like, because there are more voices that potentially could be a part of this discussion. So in that sense, I'm very hopeful for what kind of opportunities are coming up. But again, the concern is that, are we going to relegate it to tokenism, or are we genuinely and authentically going to change how things operate? I'll give I was going to do this earlier, but let me give a quick definition of tokenism. Tokenism is when you invite me in to a faculty so that you can help your white students be better white Christians. So you're asking me in to inform their formation, but you're not going to change anything. I'm just there to help the formation of the existing group. A genuine multi-ethnicity says, you're here, and because you're here, by virtue of your presence, you are changing who we are. You are changing our identity. And that's a little harder to grasp. It's easier to invite one person in from this community, one person into that community, so that our 90% white student body can be better white Christians. Or once you come in, you should be redoing what this looks like. And I think that's a conversation that hopefully will happen in the next 40 years, over the next 40 years.
Eugene, do you have any thoughts on that?
Couple things. It's the way that I begin all things. Couple things. I feel a little insecure because I haven't published a book, but in my blog, I have written on January. Let me just share a little bit about the dangers of tokenism and maybe how we can respond. So, I am a recovering cynic, and it's a prayer that I wrestle with every single day. I want to see the good and the redemptive side of things. And there are days that I do well, and some days I don't do as well. I think that is a reality for many people that are coming into ministry and even into seminary, that we have to help people grasp for the deeper hope of the gospel. Part of my cynicism of tokenism is that there is a very strong economic component to it. That it's not just what Soong-Chan mentioned, but hey, we want to make sure that we have a token person of color so that we can get people of color to come to this conference or to this seminary or to this whatever it might be, because ultimately it'll benefit the bottom line. I have had this blunt conversation with conferences because there are times I find myself the only Asian, which shocks me because I look around and there's tons of Asians that are in the audience. And somehow I realize that they basically have used my participation to ensure that these folks will get in. So I really hope that this is not, that we need to really revisit that. Mm-hmm. And I think one way that I would say as a protest that we can respond to it is, do we want to utilize our stewardship to support these things? You know, the whole theological education, it's very, very complex. And I don't have an answer. Part of the reason why it's complex is because as Asian Americans, I think we wrestle in more sophisticated, nuanced ways what we were wrestling with in our teenage and in our, teenage years or in our 20s, where what does it mean to be Korean? What does it mean to be American? What does it mean to be Chinese? What does it mean to be Filipino, Indian? We were wrestling with these things, but in more nuanced ways. And it's not just for ourselves now, but we're wrestling these things with our congregation, their children. I'm wrestling with this in a very different, fresh way because I have 3 children, ages 12, 10, and 8. And the issue of race, the conversation of race, comes up, bar none, every single week. Every single week it comes up. So I remember what you said, Soong-Chan, a while ago, that when you were feeling a little exhausted whether or not you should pursue the whole kind of, should I go at this deadly vipers thing? I remember you had this conversation with your wife, and we said, man, for our children's sake, we have to do this. So it's complex because in addition to that conversation, there's this great substantive conversation that we need to have about what does it mean to be, quote unquote, good pastors, good theologians, in a world and a context and a culture that's fast changing. So it's very difficult, but it's certainly one that we need to keep wrestling with. Yeah. All of those things, yeah. Plus whatever.
Okay, guys, before we end it, I know we're running a little bit late, but just one question. One practical suggestion you have here about the training that we can offer. You've explained really some of the issues that we need to continue to wrestle with. But Soong-Chan, you've actually written on this. You've talked about this in certain interviews about ways in which our students may be able to become better servants of the gospel in the 21st century. Could I get like a practical suggestion from you guys?
I've talked about one of the main things is, are we in places of discomfort? And are we intentionally looking for places where we are moved out of our comfort zones? And one of the ways I've said that is, are there significant mentors in your life that are from another cultural context? And that's easier to say for us as minorities because dominant culture, the positions of power, again, professors and bosses and those kinds of categories tend to be filled by dominant culture. So for many of us, we've had that experience, but I think in the past we've said the cross-cultural friendships are important. These days, almost everybody has a cross-cultural friendship, and not everybody has a cross-cultural mentor. And you know, that could mean also our reading list is greatly expanded, or our source material is greatly expanded. So I think the way we, again, combat tokenism is that these people are actually shaping and changing the way you think and who you are, rather than simply adding another voice that, you know, perpetuates the cultural captivity.
Great, that's great.
In my blog, just kidding. You know, one practical thing that I would say is, you know, I often tell, my wife tells me this. She says, if you want to invest in your children, the best thing you can do, Eugene, is to wholeheartedly pursue and invest in me. And I take that to heart. You know, I think there's a lot of wisdom there. I don't always do well in that category. But I would say the most practical thing that I can think of right now as a suggestion to, let's just say seminary, but let's just say Seattle Pacific Seminary, is that we need to really pour into, invest, challenge, invite, exhort the leaders of this seminary, the professors of the seminary, you and others as well. And my hope is that the leaders of this seminary are folks that are deeply invested and deeply committed, not only to the gospel, not only to theology, but also to the larger local church here in Seattle. And by the larger local church, you know, I think we can assume that we're talking about the larger local church, that there's genuine relationship, that the only times that we're receiving a call is not when there is a launch of a conference or a program, but there's genuine desire to listen, to hear, to attend, to worship together, to break bread together. And I think that's one of the reasons why, as one local pastor here in Seattle, I'm encouraged. But you know, when I was a student in seminary, while I certainly enjoyed the theological kind of exhortation and pursuit, if you will, there was just so much personal work that I needed to do to bridge that into the local church and into my local context. It was very, very lonely. And so that's what I would say is, if we can maybe invest into the leaders of this institution, this seminary, I think it will pour great dividends into the student body and beyond.
Wonderful.